as PR pros, quantity was always a great thing for us. I got 500,000 impressions in 2 days. That's a great figure for most PR professionals. With social media, it's slightly different. There's a hard mix of quantity and quality. So everyone's concerned with a big publication is a big publication that's much better quality, but it's really, really relevant online because it becomes hard to discern what is quality and what isn't quality unless you're an educated viewer or consumer of this information. So the first thing that we really sort of looked at here was the number of malaria-specific blogs. And this is about the only time that we'll see U.S. brought into this conversation, because the U.S., as great as we love to say things, we love to chat. We are narcissistic. We love putting out our information over and over and over, and we tend to dominate the conversation. Now that conversation is just what we consider chatting. It is background noise. There's very little value to it. It's one person posting one thing about one specific moment, and it doesn't build anywhere. So when you see these number of malaria-specific blogs in the U.S., a lot of these blogs were sort of built to try to drive revenue for a blog site. So they're automated blog posts that just pull in certain keywords. So if it had malaria or health or disease in there somewhere, an automated bot or robot would go and put this onto a blog somewhere. And what you see is there's a lot of that, and we have to filter through that here in America, and it makes our jobs really, really hard. I wish they would stop doing it because my job would get a lot easier, but obviously we can't. And this graph also shows that there's a relatively low number of conversations out there. So we're not seeing a hard number of, we would expect a larger conversation. With a pandemic of this size, if you compared it to any other sort of disease case study out there, the conversations do not relate to one another. There's just not enough chatter in the blog realm out there. And that's sad because blogs typically represent higher level communications or editorial style communications. So what we were seeing was, during this, there was around 5 new blog posts a day around malaria. Now, these numbers don't really show everything in there because these are just numbers. This isn't that qualitative data, this is quantity. A lot of those blog posts weren't of any substance, and what happens is they get put out there, and when you do a simple Google search, you're not going to filter through that. As a typical consumer of information, the first few things that come up in Google or Bing or Yahoo or whatever you use, that's kind of what you look for. You don't want to dig too deep or you reframe your search. So what we see is no one goes beyond those 3 pages in Google, so all this noise that's up there is what people actually find. Now, this is a much more telling graph. So if we have 5 blog posts a day, and they were quality blog posts, people begin to join in that conversation. They go out and they start commenting on the blog. Hey, so-and-so, great post. Have you seen this information? Or I like this information, am I passing it along? With a lot of these automated or low quality posts, the comments generally stay relatively low. I mean, no one wants to comment on a press release pickup blog or a blog that wasn't of any thought editorial behind it. There's just, that medium is not designed for that. So people want rich content that they can actually comment on. So the next thing that we sort of look at was the number of tweets per day. And again, we excluded the United States because just off the top of my head, we were in the 200 to 300 a day of tweets around malaria, and they just were not of substance. It was mostly spam, basically, of all these bots just putting information out. So we didn't want to really skew the numbers to make it look like we were dominating and having this great malaria conversation, because obviously we're not. What you see here is that there's relatively, again, a low tweet volume. There are some spikes, and we'll talk about where they come from, but all in all, there's no ongoing heavy tweeting about malaria. And of these tweets, they're the lacking kind. They're just simple posts. They're not tweets with links to important information. They're not retweets, which is the golden thing that you sort of want with your tweet. You want other people to promote that you're smart and saying great things, and you want them to push that information along. And we're not really seeing that. And that causes that lack of long tail, because no one, as Aaron mentioned, long tail, no one is going to repurpose that information because it's not good information. So all of that sort of feeds back into, again, the lack of blog content out there, because no one's going to tweet about these lackluster blogs. So all of that it was sort of negative. And the final thing that we noticed with the tweets is and this is sort of speaking to the way that we blog and tweet in the United States, is that there's a lack of patient culture with tweeting and blogging in this area. So typically, if you think of a disease case area in the United States and other countries, there's a huge lifestyle blog, there's a huge culture that talks about the disease or the epidemic, and we're not seeing that with malaria, and a lot of that has to go to what we talked about before, that it's sort of a fatalistic concept sometimes, or it's not really viewed properly as the disease that it is. So we did find a few patient tweets and forums out there, but it wasn't, what we really wanted. So the next thing that we looked at, and sort of why we positioned our research when we did, is we wanted to look at World Malaria Day to see if that day could cause a spike in the conversation. And what we found, again, this graph is going to have some quality behind the quantity. What we saw was it didn't generate the information that we were looking for. If you look at this graph, the green line represents, I believe, Germany. The green line is Germany. It looks a little different on my printout. But this green line represents Germany. If you look at this spike, you're like, wow, look at all these great blog posts that Germany put out. But Germany sort of followed the American model on this, and these are repurposed press releases and automated bots about World Malaria Day. So there's almost no engagement on this whatsoever. There was very little pushing forward after the blog posts. And then the general blogs behind it underneath, but I mean, this was a very focused day. I mean, this should have had a much larger push around it, and we didn't notice that. And if you look at the next graph, Germany is basically disappearing. There's not a lot of information because, again, these blogs were of nothing of merit, so no one's going to comment on that sort of blog. What we do see is that Spain and the UK actually had quite a bit of blog comment traffic compared to the other sort of traffic on there, and a lot of that had to do with, there were several good blog posts from the UK that talked about malaria, and people would comment on that, but also that in the UK there was a hashtag, I believe it's called Ask Tony, and it was talking about Tony Blair, and they were talking about malaria, and people were posing questions to him. So something as small as that sort of shifted the conversation. And what that really says, if something that focused can shift the conversation so dramatically, it's because the conversation's not out there. There's not enough big content being pushed out there. Now, sort of the insights that we really garnered from this is something that really flashed in our mind, was that there's no direct correlation between proximity to disease case and conversation. So you would figure countries that have a higher prevalence of being exposed to malaria would talk about it more, and it's just not true. They're not talking about it. What we noticed was, in those countries, people talked about it was like, oh, it's bad luck, or oh, I got malaria, no big deal. Like it's kind of matter of fact to them. And I mean, to me, that's shocking because I'm not exposed to malaria because I'm in the other part of the conversation, which is sort of what can I do to help malaria and to help find a cure or prevent malaria. And there's just nothing that I see relating between those two conversations. Now, another thing that we did notice is that if you're in an area where you can contract malaria, your conversation is simply about prevention. You don't have any deep science or what we can do to help move that further along in research. And in countries where you're not exposed to malaria, we don't talk about how we can help immediately. We talk about the high science and the further prevention. And there's really when we look at the next level, there's really no mishmash of that conversation. So a person who has direct exposure to malaria is not talking to a person who has access to research information or scientists or doctors. And there's really a gap there. And what we're seeing is, because malaria is not spoken in a high concept sort of way in the areas where it's affected, it's time zone inhibited. So your tweets, your posts, your information become in the moment. You're not putting out anything that after 2 p.m. anyone's going to really care about, or after the incident had happened, someone's going to look up that information. And we're really missing out on the opportunity to create a much larger community between these two very different disease case studies. So wrapping everything back up, I'll push this back over to Aaron, because he initially put out what our hypothesis was and what we were hoping to accomplish, and sort of what we figured out from all of this.
So hypothesis 1 wasn't either confirmed or rejected in either direction. As Anthony's kind of talked about, there's a bit of inconsistency in dialogue, and it's because the dialogue is following reproduction of press releases. So depending upon what people are putting out, we might see conversation about prevention, we might see conversation about symptom management, but there was no real pattern or trend, which is worrying if we're thinking about prophylaxis and preventable measures to limit the impact of the disease. Conversation between countries didn't occur, so that sharing of personal experiences, that sharing of information that makes malaria relevant didn't happen. And we saw a limited impact of any type of official healthcare institution within this social media space. So people who have the knowledge, have the expertise, and have the valuable insights to share weren't really participating. And finally, World Malaria Day didn't cause the long tail that Anthony discussed. So here we see two commonalities. Neither of those points of commonality, though, really speak with any kind of emotion or anything which could be leveraged by someone wishing to undertake social media for malaria. So taking it back to our methodology and looking for a personal engaging proposition, what is going on with malaria, and why are people not talking about it? They're not talking about it because it's not relevant either if you're in a country which is endemic because you're fatalistic to it, or if you're in a country with low prevalence, whatever, it's not my problem. And there's nothing stimulating the conversation, and there's nothing saying if we came together, here's an action plan we could take to make a difference. So distilling all of that thinking down to find a personal engaging proposition, we would like to suggest that the top sentence here is the key insight from all of this research, which could then be used to plan tactically for social media across markets. So through science, collaboration and action, we can stop malaria impacting people you care about. So a personal engaging proposition, how do we use that? This is not necessarily a sentence that would ever appear in external material, but what it is a sentence to guide all of our thinking, all of our planning, and to help us to come up with tactics. So bring science to the table, because we've seen from the data that people are interested and want to share that. Show that collaboration can make a difference. Really look for a call to action in the activities. You're not getting that with the kind of spammy content that Anthony outlined. And I think most importantly, show that malaria has an impact on people you care about. So either your friends and family who might be travelling, or more broadly, the global community. One of the trends we've seen with social media is that the idea of geographical communities has changed. Geography has become an issue of connections. People sat around a table here today having a working relationship and sharing that and interacting daily via social media. It's not a question of geographical boundary, but it is a question of relationship. So again, that can be really leveraged to make a difference for malaria.